I never thought I'd be the type of person to tell a story like this, but what happened to me in my childhood home in Plano, Texas, still gives me nightmares. This was back in 2019, when I was 22, and had just moved back in with my parents after graduating college. I was trying to save money for my own place while job hunting, so I was sleeping in my old bedroom on the second floor. The house was in one of those quiet suburban neighborhoods where everyone knows each other and nothing exciting ever happens. My parents had lived there for over 15 years, and the most dramatic thing that had ever occurred was when the Johnsons' dog got loose and dug up Mrs. Peterson's garden. My bedroom faced the backyard, and there was a large oak tree outside my window that I used to climb as a kid. The branches came close to the house, close enough that during storms, they'd sometimes scrape against the glass. I was used to those sounds. They were actually comforting, like white noise that helped me sleep. So, the first time I noticed something was wrong, it was on a Wednesday night in late September. I'd been job hunting all day and was exhausted, so I went to bed around 10 p.m. The weather was calm, no wind at all, which was unusual for Texas in the fall. I remember thinking how quiet everything was as I drifted off to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of scratching against my window. At first, I figured it was just the oak tree branches, even though there was no wind. Sometimes old houses settle and shift, making branches move unexpectedly. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but the scratching continued. It wasn't the random, chaotic sound of branches scraping against glass during a storm. This was deliberate, slow, methodical scratching, like someone drawing patterns on the window with their fingernail. I lay there for maybe 10 minutes listening. The sound would stop for a while, then start again. Always the same rhythm. Always the same deliberate pace. Finally, my curiosity got the better of me, and I got up to look outside. I pulled back the curtain just a little and peered out. The backyard was dark except for the security light my dad had installed near the garage. I could see the oak tree clearly, and its branches weren't moving at all. There was no wind, no reason for anything to be scraping against my window. That's when I saw him. There was a man standing perfectly still next to the tree trunk, maybe 15 feet from my window. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like dark clothing. I couldn't make out his face because he was standing in the shadows, but I could tell he was looking directly up at my window. My heart started pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I let the curtain fall back and stepped away from the window, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. Maybe it was just the shadow of the tree trunk, or a trick of the light from the security lamp. But then the scratching started again, and this time, I was sure it wasn't branches. I stood frozen in the middle of my room, listening to the slow, deliberate scratching against the glass. Someone was outside my second-story window, scratching at it with something. Fingernails, a key, maybe a knife. The sound sent chills down my spine. I wanted to call out to my parents, but their bedroom was at the other end of the house, and I was afraid that making noise would let the person outside know I was awake and aware of them. Instead, I grabbed my phone and crept back to the window. This time, I used my phone's camera to peek through the curtain, thinking maybe I could get a photo or video of whoever was out there. When I looked at the screen, I could see the backyard clearly in the phone's night mode, but the area by the tree was empty. No one was there. But the scratching continued. I was starting to panic. Either someone was outside my window and somehow invisible to my phone's camera, or I was losing my mind. Neither option was particularly comforting. I decided to call the police. I know it sounds like an overreaction, but the scratching had been going on for over 30 minutes at this point, and I was genuinely scared. I dialed 911 and whispered to the dispatcher what was happening. 2 officers arrived about 15 minutes later. I watched from my window as they walked around the backyard with flashlights, checking the area around the oak tree. One of them even climbed up on a ladder to look at my window from the outside. They didn't find anything. No footprints in the soft soil around the tree, no scratches on the window, no sign that anyone had been there. The officer who came to the door told my dad that they'd patrol the area more frequently over the next few nights. But there wasn't much else they could do without evidence. My blood went cold. The person was coming directly toward the back door where I was standing. In the dim light, I couldn't tell if it was the same man I'd seen in the parking lot earlier, but the height and build looked similar. I quickly stepped back inside and locked the door behind me. Through the small window, I watched the figure approach the building. He walked around the perimeter, checking doors and windows, trying to see inside. When he reached the front of the diner, I could see him through the main windows. It was definitely the same man from the parking lot. Same dark clothes, same unsettling stillness. He stood outside the front door for several minutes, just looking in. I was terrified he would try to come inside, but he eventually walked away and disappeared back toward the railroad yard. I immediately called the police from the diner's phone. The cops arrived about 15 minutes later, but by then, the railroad yard was quiet and empty. They took my statement and said they'd increase patrols in the area, but I got the impression this wasn't the first time someone had reported suspicious activity around the tracks. I never saw him again after that night, but I moved out of my parents' house within a week. I told them I'd found a job in Dallas and needed to be closer to work, which was partly true. But the real reason was that I couldn't handle sleeping in that room anymore. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, standing by that oak tree, waiting for someone new to move into the house. I've never told anyone the full story, not my parents, not my friends, not even my therapist. How do you explain something that you can see, but cameras can't capture? I still live in the Dallas area, but I made sure to get a place on the first floor. I can't handle the thought of someone standing outside a second-story window, scratching at the glass and waving like they know something I don't. The worst part is that I've started noticing scratches on windows everywhere I go now. Tiny marks that could be from tree branches or cleaning, but might be something else entirely. Once you've heard that sound, that slow, deliberate scratching in the middle of the night, you never forget it. This happened to me last summer when I was driving back to my apartment in Gainesville, Florida, after visiting my grandmother in rural Georgia. I was a senior at the University of Florida, and I'd made this drive dozens of times before without any problems. It's about a 4-hour trip through some pretty isolated stretches of highway, especially once you get into the back roads of northern Florida. I always preferred driving at night because there was less traffic, and the summer heat was unbearable during the day. I'd usually leave my grandmother's house around 10 p.m. and get back to Gainesville by 2 a.m. The route I took went through a lot of small towns and farming communities, with long stretches where you might not see another car for 30 minutes or more. On this particular night in July, I left a little later than usual, around 11:30 p.m. My grandmother had been telling me stories about her childhood, and time just got away from us. I wasn't worried, though, since I knew the route well and had plenty of gas. The first 2 hours of the drive were completely normal. I listened to music, made a few hands-free calls to friends, and stopped once at a gas station to grab some coffee. It was when I got onto the smaller county roads in northern Florida that things started to feel off. I was driving down a particularly isolated stretch, nothing but pine forests on both sides of the road, when I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. That wasn't unusual in itself, but something about the way the other car was driving caught my attention. It was maintaining the exact same distance behind me, even when I sped up or slowed down. At first, I thought it might be coincidence. Maybe the other driver was just being cautious on the dark, winding road. But after about 10 minutes of this behavior, I started to get suspicious. I decided to test whether the car was actually following me. I slowed down to about 45 miles per hour in a 55 zone, thinking the other driver would get impatient and pass me. Instead, they slowed down too, maintaining that same distance behind me. Then I sped up to 65, and they matched my speed exactly. Now I was starting to worry. I tried to get a better look at the car behind me, but their headlights were too bright and positioned in a way that made it impossible to see the make and model, or even how many people were inside. I decided to take a detour to see if they would follow. There was a small town called Cedar Springs coming up, and I knew there was a 24-hour truck stop there where I could pull over and see what happened. I put on my turn signal well in advance and took the exit. The car followed me. My heart started racing as I pulled into the truck stop parking lot. The car behind me didn't pull into a parking space. Instead, it stopped at the edge of the lot, just sitting there with the engine running and headlights pointed toward my car. I sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to figure out what to do. The truck stop was well lit, and there were a few other people around. Some truckers grabbing food, a couple filling up their gas tank. I felt relatively safe, but I was scared to get out of my car with that other vehicle just sitting there watching me. After about 5 minutes, I decided to go inside the truck stop and maybe call someone, or at least wait until the other car left. As soon as I started walking toward the building, I heard a car door slam behind me. I didn't turn around to look, but I picked up my pace. The automatic doors of the truck stop seemed to take forever to open, and I could hear footsteps behind me on the asphalt. Heavy footsteps, like someone wearing boots. Once I got inside, I immediately went to the counter and asked the clerk if I could use their phone to call the police. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "There's someone following you, honey?" she asked quietly. I nodded and explained the situation. She let me use the phone behind the counter while keeping an eye on the front door. I called 911 and explained that I thought someone was following me, giving them the location of the truck stop. While I was on the phone, I heard the automatic doors open and close. The clerk's expression changed, and she mouthed, "Is that him?" to me. I turned around slowly and saw a tall man in jeans and a dark jacket standing near the entrance, just looking around the store like he was a normal customer. But he wasn't shopping. He was watching me. The man appeared to be in his 40s, with graying hair and a scraggly beard. What struck me most was how calm he seemed, like this was all perfectly normal to him. He picked up a candy bar from a nearby display and walked to another counter, but his eyes kept drifting back to where I was standing. The dispatcher told me that a patrol car was about 20 minutes away and advised me to stay in the truck stop until the officer arrived. I thanked her and hung up, but when I looked toward the entrance, the man was gone. The clerk and I both looked around the store, but he had apparently left while I was finishing my phone call. We went to the windows and looked out at the parking lot, and I could see that the car that had been following me was gone too. I waited for the police officer anyway, and when he arrived, I gave him a description of both the man and the car. He was professional and took my concerns seriously, offering to escort me back to the main highway. I gratefully accepted. The rest of the drive to Gainesville was uneventful, and I started to feel like maybe I had overreacted. Maybe the guy really was just a normal customer who happened to be driving in the same direction as me. Maybe it was all a coincidence. But when I got back to my apartment, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tucked under my windshield wiper was a small piece of paper with a handwritten note. In messy handwriting, it said, "You have a nice apartment. Ground floor is so convenient." I lived on the ground floor of a small apartment complex, and my unit was easily accessible from the parking lot. The note meant that someone had not only followed me home, but had walked right up to my car while I was inside, presumably asleep. I immediately called the police again, and they sent an officer to take a report and collect the note as evidence. They also increased patrols around my apartment complex for the next few weeks. I never found out who left the note, or if it was the same person who had followed me that night. The handwriting analysis didn't turn up any matches in their database, and there were no fingerprints on the paper. For the rest of that summer, I changed my routine completely. I started driving to my grandmother's house during the day, even though it meant dealing with the heat. I also started varying my route, never taking the same roads twice in a row. But the thing that bothered me most was the realization of how vulnerable I had been. Someone had followed me for hours on isolated country roads, watched me from a parking lot, and then somehow figured out where I lived and left me a message to let me know they could get to me whenever they wanted. I still make that drive to visit my grandmother, but I'm much more careful now. I always tell someone my route and expected arrival time. I keep my phone charged and ready to call for help, and I never drive alone at night on those back roads anymore. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't stopped at that truck stop, or if the clerk hadn't been so helpful, or if I had decided to confront the man instead of calling the police. But mostly I try not to think about it too much. The worst part is not knowing who it was or what they wanted. Was it random? Or had they been watching me for weeks before that night? Are they still out there, following other young women on dark country roads? I moved to a different apartment after graduation, one on the third floor with better security. But I still check my windshield wipers every time I come home, just in case there's another note waiting for me. I moved into my first apartment in Portland, Oregon, right after graduating college in 2021. It was a small one-bedroom unit on the third floor of an older building in the Pearl District, and I was excited to finally have my own place. The rent was steep, but I'd landed a decent job at a tech startup, and the location was perfect. Close to downtown, but still quiet at night. The apartment came with a small balcony that overlooked the courtyard of the building complex. It wasn't much, just big enough for a couple of chairs and some plants. But I loved having outdoor space. I'd sit out there in the evenings with my laptop, working on freelance projects, or just enjoying the view. The building was U-shaped, with apartments facing both the street and the interior courtyard. My balcony was on the courtyard side, which meant I could see into some of the other apartments across the way. Most of my neighbors were young professionals like me, and everyone seemed to mind their own business. For the first few months, everything was great. I felt safe and comfortable in the building, and I'd gotten to know a few of my neighbors in passing. The only minor complaint I had was that the walls were thin, so you could sometimes hear conversations or music from adjacent units. But that's pretty normal for older buildings. The first time I noticed something odd was in early October. I was sitting on my balcony around 9 p.m., working on my laptop, when I became aware that someone was watching me. You know that feeling you get when someone's staring at you? That prickly sensation on the back of your neck? I looked up and scanned the windows of the apartments across the courtyard. Most of them had their curtains drawn or lights off, but I could see into a few units where people were watching TV or moving around. Everything looked normal. I went back to my work, but the feeling persisted. After a few more minutes, I looked up again, and this time, I saw him. There was a man standing on one of the balconies directly across from mine, maybe 50 feet away. He was partially hidden behind a support pillar, but I could see that he was looking in my direction. The balcony he was standing on belonged to a unit that I'd never seen occupied. The windows were always dark, and I'd never noticed any signs of life there. For a moment, I wondered if maybe there was a new tenant I hadn't met yet. I gave a small wave, thinking maybe I should introduce myself to my new neighbor. But the man didn't wave back. He just continued standing there, watching me. Something about his stillness made me uncomfortable, so I decided to go inside. I didn't think much about it at the time. Maybe he was shy, or maybe he hadn't seen my wave. But over the next few days, I started noticing him more often. Always on that same balcony, always watching my apartment. The thing that really started to bother me was that I never saw him during the day. It was only at night, and only when I was out on my balcony. If I went outside to water my plants or check my phone, within a few minutes I'd spot him standing there in the shadows. I decided to do a little investigating. I asked my downstairs neighbor, Maria, if she knew anything about the person living in the unit across from mine. She looked confused and told me that apartment had been vacant for months. The previous tenant had moved out over the summer, and as far as she knew, no one new had moved in. That night I made a point of looking more carefully at the apartment. The windows were still dark, and I couldn't see any furniture or personal belongings inside. But when I stepped onto my balcony around 10 p.m., sure enough, there he was on the balcony across from me. This time I got a better look at him. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothing that made him blend into the shadows of the balcony. I couldn't make out his face clearly, but something about his posture suggested he was older, maybe in his 40s or 50s. I decided to confront him directly. I called out, "Hey, do you live there?" But he didn't respond. He just continued standing there, motionless, staring at me. I went inside and called the building management company. The after-hours number went to voicemail, so I left a message explaining the situation and asking them to call me back. I also made a note to follow up during business hours. The next morning, I called the management office and spoke to the property manager, Linda. She confirmed that the unit in question was indeed vacant and had been for several months. She seemed concerned about my report and promised to send someone to check the apartment that day. Linda called me back that afternoon to let me know that maintenance had inspected the vacant unit. They found no signs of forced entry or unauthorized access. The apartment was empty and secure, with all locks intact. "Are you sure you saw someone on that balcony?" she asked. Maybe it was shadows or a reflection from another window. I assured her that I had definitely seen a person, not shadows or reflections. She said they would keep an eye on the situation and asked me to call immediately if I saw anything else suspicious. That night I decided to document what I was seeing. I set up my phone to record video and waited on my balcony. Sure enough, around 10:15 p.m., the figure appeared on the vacant balcony across from me. I started recording, but when I looked at the footage later, I could barely make out anything. The lighting in the courtyard was dim, and the figure blended so well into the shadows that it was nearly impossible to see him in the video. To someone who hadn't been there, it would just look like an empty balcony. This pattern continued for almost 2 weeks. Every night when I went outside, he would appear on the balcony across from me. I started timing it, and he always showed up within 5 minutes of me stepping outside. It was like he was watching for me from inside the apartment. But that was impossible, according to the property management company. The apartment was vacant and locked. I decided to try an experiment. One evening, I turned off all my lights and sat quietly inside my apartment, watching the vacant unit through my window. Around 10 p.m., the usual time, I saw a faint light appear briefly in one of the windows, as if someone had used a phone or flashlight. 5 minutes later, I stepped onto my balcony, and there he was in his usual spot. I called the police this time. 2 officers came to investigate, and I showed them the balcony where I'd been seeing the figure. They spoke to the property manager and got permission to enter the vacant apartment. They found it empty, just as management had claimed. No signs that anyone had been living there. No way someone could have accessed the balcony without going through the apartment. The sliding door to the balcony was locked from the inside. One of the officers suggested that I might be seeing reflections or shadows from other parts of the building. He was polite, but clearly skeptical of my story. The other officer took some notes and said they'd increase patrols in the area, but I could tell they didn't take it very seriously. After the police left, I felt foolish and frustrated. Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe the stress of living on my own for the first time, combined with long hours at my new job, was making me paranoid. But that night, he was there again. Same balcony, same position, same unwavering stare. I decided I couldn't handle it anymore. I started keeping my curtains closed and stopped using my balcony altogether. Within a few days, I noticed that I wasn't feeling watched anymore. Whatever or whoever it was had apparently lost interest once I stopped going outside. I lived in that apartment for another 8 months, but I never used the balcony again. I eventually moved to a different building across town, partly because I wanted more space, but mostly because I never felt comfortable in that apartment after the incidents with the watcher. Sometimes I drive past my old building and look up at the balconies. The apartment across from my former unit is still vacant, according to the rental listings I've checked online. I wonder if the new tenant in my old place has seen anything strange, or if whatever was watching me has moved on to someone else. The thing that bothers me most is that I never found out what I was really seeing. Was it a person somehow accessing a locked apartment? Was it my imagination? Or was it something else entirely? Something that cameras can't capture and police can't investigate. I still avoid balconies when I can, especially at night. There's something about standing in that exposed space, knowing that you can be seen from multiple directions. That makes me deeply uncomfortable now. I prefer ground floor apartments with patios, where at least I know who might be watching.